Earth. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Sarrett on Zoomer Radio.
Thanks for inviting me into your home, RV, camper, taxi, your parents' basement, your loft, that greasy spoon just off the interstate, and your cabin in the woods. Hello to everyone listening to this transmission on Zoomer Radio, AM 740, 96.7 FM here in Toronto, across Ontario, parts of Quebec, New York State, clear on down to the Carolinas. Howdy to all of you tuning us in on one of our affiliate stations across North America. And hey there to our mobile app users, Zoomer Radio and the Conspiracy Show apps. Those who stream the show at zoomerradio.ca and those who stream the show on my YouTube channel, Strange Planet. In his first book, The Valleys of the Noble Beyond, In Search of the Sasquatch, John Zada details his journeys into the remote Great Bear Rainforest region of British Columbia, where he collected stories of Sasquatch from the First Nation indigenous communities and others. John is a journalist and photographer based in Toronto. He has an interest in adventure travel and remote regions, which have taken him to some far-flung parts of the world. His work has appeared in such publications as the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, The Guardian, The Telegraph, Travel and Leisure, BBC, CBC, Al Jazeera, New York Post, Explore, Maisonneuve, Monte Cristo, the LA Review of Books, and Toque and Canoe, and Canadian Business. John Zada, welcome to The Conspiracy Show. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
You know, you're a travel writer. You take wonderful photographs. You're a journalist. Did you ever imagine when you started off in your career that the first book, your first book, would be about Sasquatch?
No, I did not have any idea about that. And in fact, it was quite the opposite. I've spent many years abroad working in the Middle East as a journalist, as a documentary filmmaker, a writer, photographer covering, I guess, what people would consider to be more serious, newsworthy stories, particularly Middle East-related stuff like the conflict out there, and maybe even just also doing some lighter stuff, travel pieces and cultural pieces. But no, it never really crossed my mind that it would ever come to that. And I think what had happened was I'd spent several years living in Dubai, in Beirut, in Cairo, working as a freelancer, and I got tired. I got a little bit worn down from all of the flying and traveling and all of the demands of that work. And I came back to Canada and started to do work here. And as I started to travel across the country and see places that I've never seen, and I became increasingly interested in doing Canada-related work. And I think what happened was I just ended up in BC. An old interest in the Sasquatch drew me partly there, partly for work. And those two things basically came together, and I came up with an idea for a book.
And why not? I mean, it is part of of Canadian lore, certainly for the Pacific Northwest. I mean, the term Sasquatch, I think, was coined by the Salish.
That's right.
I know you were north of Vancouver, but where exactly are the Valleys of the Noble Beyond?
The title of the book is In the Valleys of the Noble Beyond, and that is my coinage. So people don't actually call it that. That title came from a conversation that takes place in the story in which a resident there described the area as the Noble Beyond. But the actual region is known more as the Great Bear Rainforest, and it is an area the size of roughly Ireland. It extends from roughly the northern part of Vancouver Island all the way up to the Alaska Panhandle. So I would say the central and the north coast of British Columbia. And it is the largest intact temperate rainforest in the world. It is a kind of a Shangri-La, a mountainous, forested, essentially rainforest that is pristine and largely unviolated, and has over the years gotten some protection for the environment there. And in a way, if you could imagine a place where Sasquatches would reside and possibly even be a last holdout for Sasquatches if all other areas of the continent or the world became overrun by civilization, this would be the place. And when I grew up as a kid, I read Sasquatch books at the library when I used to go there, and a lot of the early research done by Sasquatch, investigators here in Canada tended to focus on that part of British Columbia because there are indigenous communities there. They've got a lot of Sasquatch lore in their culture, and it was an area of many, many, many reports. And I thought it would be really great to go to this wonder of nature, truly a jewel in the Earth's crown of natural wonders, and also do a Sasquatch book at the same time about it.
And how does one get to the Great Bear Rainforest? By plane or by boat?
Yeah, so there is only really one main road that reaches one community in the Great Bear Rainforest, a place called Bella Coola, and you'd have to drive probably about 20 hours or so to get there from, let's say, the lower mainland of British Columbia. But yes, you either fly from either Vancouver or Port Hardy on the north tip of Vancouver Island, or you take ferries, again, also from Port Hardy, from the north end of the island to the coast. Even float planes go there. So it is a coastal region. It is an area defined primarily by its abundance of water, and remote communities, small communities. Some of them fly in, and yes, it does take a bit of effort to get to these places. But when you do get there, it's quite rewarding.
And tell me about the people there. I mentioned Sasquatch is a Salish word, but is it part of the Salish nation, or who lives on this land?
They're a cluster of different First Nations peoples, and together they call themselves the Coastal First Nations. I guess that's more of a sort of a political alliance, I would say. But a handful of nations, they're coastal, Northwest indigenous people. They share primarily the same culture. Their settlements have dated back, I think one as old as 14,000 years, but others, 10,000, 11,000 years of age. And they range from anywhere from 1,500 people to maybe 40 people, and lots of traditions, lots of stories. They were hunters. They were people who lived lives based on fishing and cedar trees, creating products from that. They're people of the land, essentially, and they are still there and have a lot of Sasquatch lore in their culture. And they give different names for the creatures. And so I basically went from community to community, spent time there, talked to the people, heard their stories, and documented them for the book. The place in their culture spans storytelling. So they appear in their tales. They're considered real flesh and blood creatures as well. And then, for others, they have a supernatural significance, sort of in the same way that people who have more of a metaphysical take on the Sasquatch see them as, moving between dimensions and dematerializing and appearing and disappearing and that kind of thing.
And how easy or difficult was it to get the locals there to open up and share this knowledge with an outsider?
Right. Well, historically, if you go back and look at the older research and the older Sasquatch books, such as John Green's books, who he was based out of Harrison Hot Springs in British Columbia, they talked a lot about how Native communities were reticent, they were more reluctant to speak, they were fearful of being ridiculed, and I think that was not just in part because they're indigenous and they were sort of looked down upon by the white man, but also it was a sign of the times. And you go back to the 50s or the 60s or even the 70s, it was a more conservative time. But now with the internet and reality television and all these shows and Finding Bigfoot, and it's the stigma doesn't really exist anymore. And so when I went to these places, I thought, okay, it's going to be a bit tough. Who the hell is this guy coming to the community asking these questions? And I thought there'd be a lot more work involved to get people to speak. But in fact, people were really, really, really enthusiastic about sharing their stories. And I think that's partly also because it's a subject that really excites people up there. And the fact that someone from the outside is interested, I think also excited them as well.
And have these stories been that you received from them, were they passed down through the oral tradition, generation to generation, stories maybe around the fireplace or the campfire, a grandfather or great-grandfather saw one in the woods or encountered one, or were you getting also sort of some first-person eyewitness testimony?
It was all of the above. So the stories ranged from old family stories that had some kind of a supernatural element to them, to something my grandfather or that my great-grandfather or that my cousin or that my uncle has seen or that I've seen. It was basically everything. And children in these cultures, generally speaking, tend to be told Sasquatch stories, and I'm using the generic term Sasquatch, but it would differ from nation to nation, sort of scare stories to keep children in their place and to, say that, if you misbehave, the Juniqua will come and take you and she's going to put you in her basket and go back to her cave and eat you. So a lot of people growing up in these communities tended to learn about these creatures by way of these stories when they were kids. And what that has, in my view, in my experience, has tended to do is it's caused a lot of them growing into adults to not believe in the Sasquatch. But then if and when they do see one, their whole worldview changes. So often when someone tells you that they've seen one, they'll often preface the tale by saying, their story by saying, I never believed in this because I thought it was just a scare story when I was a kid.
Could you share one of those stories that you received from, say, a young adult who was skeptical, thought it was, like the bogeyman, and then they ended up having their own encounter?
Yes. So I traveled to a community called Klemtu, which is a small village of about 500 people on the north coast. It's the primary town of the Kitasoo Jejes First Nation. And I was going for a hike up to a lake above the town. It's also the water reservoir where there's a lot of reports. And as I was coming back down the trail to the town, there's a little salmon hatchery there where they help to support their salmon populations. And I met a young guy. He might have been he was somewhere in his teens, maybe his late teens, who works there occasionally. And I struck up a conversation with him, and he told me that he had had his own experience. And basically it had happened, I think, maybe the year before or the summer before. And he had been doing an overnight shift at the hatchery. It was some kind of a job to, I guess, he was watching over the operations there over the evening. And he was sitting at a desk by this window, and this is in the forest, mind you, it's right on the edge of town. And he said that at around 3 a.m, he looked out the window, and there's a little bit of a light out there, and he saw this huge, hairy, muscular creature walk right past him in his view of the window, except he could see only like the body up until maybe the top of the chest. The thing was so massive that its head was above the window, and it basically was tiptoeing and walked right by. Like, it was almost as if it were unaware that he was there, and it was maybe stealthily approaching the village. And I think he got completely freaked out, and then within the next minute or two, the thing walked back again in the other direction. And so he got so scared he went and locked himself in the back room and basically stayed there till daylight, and then left and told everybody.
And how common are these stories among the peoples of the Great Bear Rainforest? Does every family have a story, or give me a sense of how common or rare it is?
Well, I would definitely say that because of the cultural tie-in, there are more stories in these communities than in most, let's say, run-of-the-mill, non-indigenous Western or Pacific Northwest towns. Having said that, not everybody in these communities believes in them. And I did meet a lot of people who spend a lot of time out in the bush. They hunt, they fish, they're really outdoors people. And I think that it's partly an issue of the ego in some ways. I think that those who really in those communities don't believe in them, and perhaps rightly so. I mean, I'm not so certain that I'm not 100% certain that they exist, but they say, well, if they do exist, I would have seen one by now. And you hear that from a lot of people. Those who don't believe basically take that position because they feel that if they do exist, that they themselves must see them. So, yeah, I would, and I can't give you an exact figure of the breakdown between. I didn't really take a poll or have any kind of numbers, but I mean, I would say for every, it's probably split half. I would say it's probably about half, or maybe 2/3 believing or knowing or having stories, and then a good solid third at a minimum who are like, no way.
And you mentioned that as a young man or as a child, you read stories about Bigfoot. Do you remember which one that sort of initially captured your imagination?
Well, there is a famous story about an incident in 1924 involving a bunch of miners who were prospecting in the Mount St. Helens area of southern Washington State, and they were in an area known as Ape Canyon. I mean, even just the name of the place is named after kind of these like monkey ape type creatures. It's got this ominous tone to it. They were there prospecting. They were apparently shadowed or stalked by a bunch of Sasquatch. One of the miners fired on the creatures. I think it fell into the canyon, and they retreated to their cabin that night or the next night. And what happened was, while they were at the cabin, they were basically swarmed by this troop or this group of Sasquatch that over the course of the night attacked them with rocks and with sticks and were banging on the walls and jumping up and down on the roof. It was essentially a swarming. And afterwards, the attack let up. Nothing happened. None of these creatures got into the cabin. But when the miners got back to civilization, the newspapers picked up on the story. There was a huge hunt for the creatures. It made the papers, and I think later on, when Sasquatch became more of a pop culture thing and really hit the news big time after '58 with the discovery of the tracks at Bluff Creek, people who were subsequently doing research about these old stories found them in the newspapers. I think it was the Oregonian, and then put them in the books. And I think as a kid, like, you're reading these books at night, right? And you're hearing about Ape Canyon and creatures attacking the cabin, and like it's a pretty frightening story. And this is not supposed to be fictitious. This is like a book that is purporting to contain stories that are real life stories. And so, yeah, I mean, it does make an impression on you as a kid.
Sure, I can see why. As you say, this is not comic book fantasy. This is a story that ended up making the newspaper. And did you read any of Burns' early work? Like, there was an article, I think, in Maclean's magazine back in 1929. Although it was published on April Fool's Day, that might have been the publisher's sort of, joke. But did you read Burns' work as well?
Yeah, I have. I have read some of his pieces, including the one that ran on that day. That I guess is the one that is most attributed to the coining of the word Sasquatch. And yeah, it's difficult. I mean, this was back in the 1920s, and I think he continued to write a few more pieces into the early 1930s. He was either a teacher or a principal or both at a school on the native reservation in the area, and it's, the sources are at odds in terms of what his real intentions and take were on the issue. You have some people who claim that he never really believed in the Sasquatch and was just writing about it just more as a cultural thing and for fun. And then you have others who have said that, no, he was actually really serious and he wanted to protect the creatures. And so, I mean, these are of course problems of scholarship and of history when, decades and, almost a century's passed and the person's gone and there isn't really much documentation. So I think the jury's out in terms of where he actually stood on it. But yes, his articles are still there. And I mean, at the very least, he was interested in some manner. And I guess that must speak to, something within him, within his imagination.
All right, we'll take a time out and we'll come back and continue to explore the valleys of the noble beyond in search of the Sasquatch with author John Zada right here on The Conspiracy Show. Don't go away.
The owners of the system are asleep. Now we can play. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Sarrett from Zoomer Radio.
John, can you share another story, maybe one that was sort of passed down from generation to generation while you were visiting the Great Bear Rainforest?
Yeah, I was in, I believe it was Bella Coola, which is a Newhawk First Nation community. It's on the inside coast, which is Bella Coola is. Let me just preface this really quickly by saying that Bella Coola is generally considered to be a kind of the mecca of Sasquatch in the Great Bear Rainforest, and perhaps even in the whole BC coast. It's an area of tremendous mountains, huge valleys, and the Sasquatches there are reported to be, everywhere and seen all the time. And so I was speaking with a carver who lives in the community who I think he might have been in his 70s when I met him several years ago, and who had a lot of part of a really big family, a lot of history in his family. And he spoke about, I think it was his uncle who had been out with a buddy of his fishing, and they had, I guess, pulled ashore to, I guess, spend some time and eat lunch on shore. And I think the uncle got up to go and, take a leak or something or whatever. And so when he dropped his pants, he looked through the bushes, and there was this huge Sasquatch looking at him, and it was literally 10 feet away. So the thing that had happened was he'd wandered off to relieve himself, but he had, without knowing it, walked right towards a Sasquatch that was there, in the trees, probably staring at them, watching them for as long as they had come ashore, essentially. And he basically turned around, ran off towards the boat, trying to pull his pants up and everything. And then he wasn't able to speak. And then his friend was like, "What's going on?" And he waved him over to the boat, and then they end up, taking off. And those tend to be these tend to be the stories. It's these very, very short encounters that don't last very long. And, both the Sasquatch and the humans involved, the people who see them, tend to be stunned for a period of time. And it's this kind of these moments of almost trauma, it would seem.
I can imagine it would be very traumatic.
Yeah.
Have the communities up there, have they embraced Bigfoot or Sasquatch in the way, let's say, Roswell, New Mexico has embraced that whole phenomena with museums, or at least, they're proud of it? Welcome to Sasquatch country signs or anything like that?
No, you don't really get a lot of that up where I was traveling on the coast. And in fact, it's a little more the opposite. It's more low key. Because it's cultural, there is a bit of a sacredness attached to the subject, and not really much attempt to cash in on it. And but in contrast, if you go to Harrison Hot Springs, which is 90 minutes east of Vancouver, which is where J.W. Burns, this teacher guy who we were just talking about earlier, coined this anglicized version of the native word there in Sasquatch. That community has embraced that whole thing, and tourism board promotes it. There are statues everywhere. There are these sort of painted footprints, and there is some degree of cooperation or collusion with the local First Nation there. They put on a kind of a festival called, I think it's Sasquatch Days once a summer, and where they do Sasquatch dances and picnics and sort of outdoor stuff. And so you do find that ritualistic, celebratory, quasi-commercial aspect to it there. I think partly because the town is located off of the highway, and there are tourists in the area, and tourists go there anyway for the hot springs. But no, on the central and the north coast of BC, it's a lot more subtle. It's a lot more low key. Among the residents, there is a lot of banter and talk of Sasquatch informally, but no attempt to monetize it.
And talk to me about the sacred nature of Sasquatch to them. Why they look at Sasquatch as a sacred creature.
Well, again, for those who do subscribe to their local variation of Sasquatch, to those people in those nations, many of them do consider them to be spiritual beings, and beings who, depending on the person, depending on the First Nation, depending on the creature, can be either benevolent, good-natured generally, or malevolent. And so, I think, in the town of Bella Bella, I tended to hear more stories generally of the Sasquatch being, a nature being who's a custodian of the wild places, and a creature that appears to you when there is something to be conveyed to you, a message for you to learn. Maybe you're struggling with something, and seeing a Sasquatch somehow is an indication. It acts as a herald almost. But in Bella Coola, I found, again, generally speaking, there are exceptions, that the creatures are seen more as beings to be fearful of, beings who can perhaps curse you or paralyze you, or even through their gaze instigate death. They're almost taboo. They're things to avoid. And that's not to say that the creatures are necessarily evil or seen as evil. It's just that maybe humans aren't meant to come across them, and it's something to be avoided, and something that is unfortunately, to a lot of people, they're worthy of a terrible fate. And so those things constitute a kind of sacredness, I would say.
Sure.
Not something, in the sense of that, in the sense of the creature not being something to be trifled with.
Right. This is not kitsch. This is this is serious business.
It's serious business, exactly.
Are there any stories, legends about individuals being carried off? I think there is a story. It might have been up in the Northwest Territories or someplace about. I think there was a Canadian version of the prospector story of someone who claimed he was kidnapped. Are there any stories like that in the Great Bear Rainforest?
Well, you hear apocryphal stories that are not really attributed to anyone in particular, but you hear things about how way back, maybe a century ago or over a century ago, something had happened to somebody. I think one story, again, in the Newhawk territory that I'd heard involved a hunter who he'd been, I guess, on his fishing boat, and he traveled to a remote inlet and got, I guess, captured by a Sasquatch that had wrapped him up in cedar bark and had, I guess, wrapped him in such a way, he'd taken the guy and wrapped the cedar bark around him while pressing him against a tree or something. And so you do hear these vague stories. In Wickenow, further south, there was a story about these guys from the village who'd gone to a remote valley, and they never came back. And then when they went to send people to find them, they found their bodies missing without their heads and stuff. There is lore, but it tends to be fairly remote in time and ambiguous, and not necessarily involving anybody, any specific person in the community in particular.
And while you were there, were there reports of a recent sighting, or even a sighting while you were present? Not necessarily in the exact location, but while you were in the vicinity?
No, well, I guess it depends how recent. So on my first trip there, which was this was prior to working on the book. It was the trip that had convinced me that I should work on a book. Stuff had been happening, weeks, days, and even months, a few months before I had arrived. And so, yeah, there were loads of sightings. Sasquatches coming into town in the middle of the night, banging on people's, walls of their homes, rock throwing incidents. I mean, basically the whole gamut. That year was full of reports. And then when I went back the following year to write the book, I had come across in Klemtu, it was these construction worker guys who were from the lower mainland of BC, and they were living in a trailer there, building new homes for the community. And they were asking me what I was doing there. I didn't actually solicit them for any information. They were like, "Hey, what are you doing here?" I'm like, "Hey, I'm working on a travel memoir about the Sasquatch." And they're like, "Funny you should mention that. Like, just the other night we were in our trailer, and I'm a hunter, and my buddy here's a hunter too, and there's this thing screaming on the mountaintop. It was like, we've never heard anything like that before." And so there were a couple on the return trip, but it wasn't as the reports were not as numerous. And the locals there will tell you that that incidents tend to come in waves. And I think my initial trip prior to my book trip was at the tail end of one of those waves. And then when I went back, things had started to quiet down a little bit.
All right, we'll take another time out, and we'll come back, talk about your encounter, not with a Sasquatch, but a Sasquatch researcher. In the valleys of the noble beyond, in search of the Sasquatch, my conversation with author John Zada continues right after this on The Conspiracy Show. Don't go away. John Zada stays with us, the author of In the Valleys of the Noble Beyond, in search of the Sasquatch. So tell me about Dr. John Bindernagel, the late Dr. John Bindernagel, how you met with him, and tell us a little bit about him.
So John was a wildlife biologist who lived on Vancouver Island in the town of Courtenay. He's from, Guelph, Ontario originally, and he's essentially a scientist who became interested in the Sasquatch from an early age. He was an undergrad at the University of Guelph studying wildlife management. While he was there, he came across an article in a magazine about the creatures, and he brought the subject up in class to his professor, and his professor ridiculed him in front of all of the other students and really embarrassed him and upset him. And then John decided from that moment forward he would find the truth of, he would go in search of the truth of this whole matter, and it stuck with him his whole life. And what made John interesting was that he believed that the Sasquatch was an ape. He called it North America's great ape. He wrote a book about it, and he did a bunch of research and discovered that, or noticed that a lot of the behavioral attributes of the Sasquatch coincided a lot exactly with those of the great apes and monkeys and whatnot, and that was the thesis of his book. And he was on a crusade to convince his scientific colleagues, to convince the public that at the very least this was a subject worthy of further scientific exploration. I mean, he didn't expect people to be converted to his position, but it disappointed him to no end that his colleagues and the general public poo-pooed the subject. And that I reached out to him when I was going to do my trip to the Great Bear, to stop there in Courtenay to meet with him, and I spent time with him and got to hear a lot of his stories about his evolution as a Sasquatch researcher, the work he had done, and the professional problems that he faced trying to bring this to the attention of his scientific colleagues, whom he considered to not be interested because they didn't really know about it.
Right. And you met him towards, I guess, right near the very end of his life. He passed away in 2018, I think.
Yeah.
There was he? I mean, towards the end of his life, was he sad that that he hadn't discovered the truth about Sasquatch? The habeas corpus. That no one has ever found a body. Was he looking to pass the torch? What was his mood?
I think part of the crisis for him of his life was that as he got older and older, he felt that he faced the prospect of death without proving it to the world, but also he was fearful that his work would become eclipsed by this tsunami of material on the internet and books, self-published books by non-scientists, and he when he got the diagnosis for his cancer, which is what took his life in the end, he quadrupled his efforts to get his material on the internet and to document reports and to do more speaking engagements, and it was an existential crisis for him. And I think I think he was quite stoic about it at the same time, but I don't know, there was a kind of almost emergency in his own mind of if I don't get a certain amount of work done in a certain way, then it will all have been for naught. And yeah, I don't know. It depends. His moods shifted. There were moments where he was a bit more circumspect about it and calm, but then there were moments when he was just frustrated. And yes, those last years, those last months were periods of feverish work to make sure that there was some kind of a legacy.
Did he have any advice for you?
Well, no, I think he was appreciative that, I was contributing something. And also he was a bit envious because he couldn't get away to the Central and North Coast as often as he wanted to. The place where I went to, the Great Bear, even though it was very close to where he lives, it's kind of ironic. I'm from Toronto. It's like 10 times the distance for me to go there. But I think he was happy that I would check in with him from time to time. I did stay in touch with him after the initial trip for the book and everything, and did often tell him, I said, John, man, science and discoveries and it's a collective effort, and just because you're not the guy to have made the final call on this doesn't mean that you did not contribute to the overall effort. And I think he appreciated that. Right.
It's like, it was that old saying, was it Voltaire? If I have seen further, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants.
Right.
All right. We'll take another time out, come back. One segment remains with John Zada, the author of In the Valleys of the Noble Beyond, In Search of the Sasquatch. My name is Richard Serrett. This is The Conspiracy Show. We are into the home stretch with John Zada. We're talking Sasquatch and his new book, In the Valleys of the Noble Beyond, In Search of the Sasquatch. We were talking about the late Dr. John Bindernagel. Just one more thing I wanted to address before we move on, and that is this story that shortly before his death, I'm not sure the timing of it, but shortly before his death, it is alleged that he was taken by someone to see a dying Sasquatch that was called Fox. Are you familiar with your story and with that story, and what are your thoughts?
No, actually, I don't know that story. I know that he had, in his time as a researcher, found tracks. I know that he, I think, traveled to Kentucky to a habituation site there and he thinks maybe had glimpsed the Sasquatch. So, I mean, my latest knowledge was that he had come close, but he didn't actually share that story with me. Where did you find that?
I was doing a search on Dr. Bindernagel. I'll have to, it's just, I scribbled it in my notes, but I'll have to look back. Okay. I Googled it, basically.
I know. I mean, it's possible. I know that he had, he was really very well liked, really popular guy, had a lot of contacts across North America. John didn't just focus his researches on BC, and so and I know that he had traveled to a lot of different places and was shown a lot of evidence in regional parts of North America. So it's not impossible that somebody may have actually called him over to see something in some place.
I have the name Sally Ramey or Ramy written here in the notes, like a fellow researcher that apparently went with him. So who knows?
Yeah. I didn't hear that story.
Share another story, maybe a favorite of yours from your encounter with the peoples of Great Bear Rainforest.
Well, I've got another story that I haven't talked about yet, and this one didn't really make it into the book. So many stories didn't make it into the book because there isn't enough room, and also my book deals with a lot of other subjects. But and this one I'm about to relate isn't a favorite of mine so much because of the amazingness of the encounter or the alleged encounter, but just more of an example of just how casual these encounters can be. And so I was on a place called Denny Island at the pub there having a meal, and across from my table was a fisherman. There were a lot of commercial fishermen who go up there in the summertime to fish during the windows there that come up for a few days at a time. And he had overheard my conversation about my research for the book, and he proceeded to tell me that he had his own, what he believed to be a Sasquatch story of his own. And he basically stopped eating and just, turned around and told me how him and another fishing colleague, and he said, I think this was might have been in the 90s, late 90s or the early 2000s. He was on the North Coast, north of where I was at the time on Denny Island. He was off of an island called Renison Island, closer to a town called Prince Rupert. And he was anchored for the night right off a tiny little islet, which is off of Renison Island. And him and his colleague his pal, I guess, they were fishing, they were asleep, and they said that they were woken up by what he said sounded like a huge person, like a person with huge lungs, retching and throwing up and coughing. Something was sick in the bush just a short distance away on this islet. And it was pitch black. They couldn't see anything, but this thing for 10 minutes was like coughing and barfing and retching. And they said that they were completely afraid, not only because they were in the middle of nowhere, but that this thing, whatever it was, sounded like a person breathing, a person coughing. It didn't sound like an animal, and so they basically pulled anchor and left. And so when I told some people on Denny Island about the story, like later that afternoon or the next day, about this fisherman guy. Well, they said to me, maybe the guy that they heard was people. On Denny Island, it's a non-indigenous community, and so there's a lot less belief of the Sasquatch, or even though they're right next to Bella Bella and there's loads of Sasquatch reports there. But the non-native people were like, well, maybe those fisherman guys heard Kayak Bill being sick, and I'm like, well, who's this Kayak Bill? And apparently there was a guy who used to live in the community there, a non-native guy who used to sell, he's kind of a watercolorist or a painter by winter, and then in the summer he would kayak alone. He was kind of this hermit guy who would kayak alone on the North Coast. He built all these different shacks on these little islands on the North Coast, and he would spend his summers kind of as a hermit kayaking and then come back and begin the year again by selling his paintings. And then he vanished one day, never came back. No one knows what exactly happened to him. So I kind of found that to be a really, really beautiful encapsulation of life on the coast. You've got all this, dead serious Sasquatch lore, and then you've got these stories of characters, and it's just, and it also goes to show it's a little bit of an object lesson too, in terms of the whole conundrum of what is the Sasquatch? Is the Sasquatch really a creature, or is it something that we misperceive? I mean, it's all sort of built into that story there.
Right. Yeah, just so many wonderful legends and stories up there. You know, it harkens back to yesteryear when that was our entertainment, really. We're sitting around a fire and sharing all of these stories, whether it was Sasquatch or whether it was, you know, the Kayak Bill.
Right.
And did you go out there basically simply to speak to people, or was there any interest on your part sort of getting out and doing a little field research for yourself in hopes of catching a glimpse? Did someone take you to a spot where Bigfoot had frequented?
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, those two motives went hand in hand. I mean, I felt that there in the towns there would be the tales, but then, you know, it's funny when you spend time in a given community, it doesn't matter which one, and you hear repeatedly stories over and over again, those stories will adhere to certain places, and you hear the names of these, you know, creek systems, these rivers, these bays. They come up over and over and over again, you know, old village sites. And so what ends up happening is, you know, I didn't have my own transportation there, but everybody who lives in the towns, they do, right? They've got their own boats. That's like having cars in the cities, essentially. And so at every occasion, I would ask people if they could take me to where they're going, if they're going fishing, or if they're going to be doing any kind of, you know, there's all sorts of business one could attend to on the coast. So I did hitch a lot of rides and spend time with people and go see spots. And you know, it was really interesting. Sometimes I found myself, even by accident, like someone would be like, hey, what are you doing? You want to come for a ride? I go, yeah. And I go with them. And then I would end up in a place where I would discover later, or at the time that I got there, that this is where a Sasquatch came and like visited a bunch of people at the cabin here, kind of thing. So yes, I was really lucky. I did manage to make acquaintances and friends, and they were totally cool with me, and they took me out, and I got to actually see a lot of the places that were the venues for the story. So not only did I have the stories, but I also eventually got to have a visual of the place. And then when I would go back and talk to the people later about what happened, I could even talk to them about exactly where stuff happened. And, you know, like I had a visual map in my own mind that would make the story clearer for me.
John, thank you so much for this. I enjoyed spending some time with you.
Thanks so much. It was really fun.
My thanks to Owen Wolf and Ryan White. Next week, the great-great-grandson of the American outlaw Jesse James will be here with an unbelievable tale. Plus, Steve Santini will talk about haunted objects from shipwrecks. In the meantime, don't be afraid. There's nothing concealed that won't be revealed, and nothing hidden that won't be made known. What you hear in the dark, speak in the light. What I say in a whisper, proclaim from the housetops. Move over, Aphrodite. I'm coming home.